My sister and I used to joke that we came into the world fighting. She arrived 11 minutes before me, and I spent the next 62 years trying to catch up. Her name was Janet. Janet Louise Mercer, née Calloway. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who kept a spare key to everyone's house on a hook by her back door, who made butter tarts from scratch every Christmas Eve because our mother used to, and because she couldn't imagine a December without the smell of them. She was my best friend. She was the first person I called when my wife left, when I got the cancer scare in 2019, when my truck broke down on the 401 outside Kingston, and I didn't know what to do with myself. She always picked up. She stopped picking up in March. Her husband, a man I had never fully trusted, though I'd spent years telling myself I was being unfair, called me on a Tuesday night. His voice was flat, controlled. He said Janet had passed that afternoon. Heart failure, he said. She was 61 years old. She had no history of heart problems. She walked 3 kilometers every morning along the creek path behind her house in Orangeville. She was the healthiest person I knew. I drove up from Guelph in the dark. By the time I got to the house, her husband, I'll call him my brother-in-law because that's what he was, legally, though the word has never sat right in my mouth, had already contacted the funeral home. He'd already chosen cremation. He'd already told my nephew, Janet's son Owen, that there would be a small service, family only, no obituary in the paper. Owen was 23, still living at home, working at a hardware store in town. He looked like he'd been wrung out. His eyes were red and empty at the same time. When I tried to hug him, his stepfather was suddenly there, a hand on Owen's shoulder, redirecting him toward the kitchen. I stood in my sister's hallway and I felt the cold move through me. Not grief, not yet. Something else. Something that sat in the back of my throat, like a stone. The service was 4 days later. 11 people. The funeral director led a short ceremony at the chapel on First Street. My brother-in-law sat in the front row in a dark suit that looked new. He cried twice, both times briefly, both times in a way that seemed timed. I kept watching him. I couldn't stop. Owen sat beside him with his hands folded in his lap, and he didn't cry at all, which frightened me more than anything else that day. Afterward, in the parking lot, while people were getting into their cars and saying the things you say when there's nothing to say, a woman in a grey coat approached me. She was perhaps 50, carrying a leather folder under one arm. She asked if I was Harold Calloway, Janet's brother. I said yes. She said her name was Patricia Noel. She was Janet's solicitor. She said Janet had retained her privately 8 months ago. She asked if I could meet her the following morning, at her office in Orangeville, before I drove home. She said, please don't mention this to your brother-in-law, or to Owen, for now. Janet was very specific about that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the spare bedroom of my sister's house. My brother-in-law had offered, and I hadn't known how to refuse without causing a scene, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle and tried to remember the last time I'd heard my sister's voice. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks before she died. She'd called to tell me the lilac bush in the backyard had finally bloomed after 2 years of nothing. She said she was going to cut some and put them in the kitchen. Her voice had been, I kept coming back to this, careful, not sad, exactly, careful. Not sad, exactly. Careful, like someone choosing their words. At 9 the next morning, I was sitting in Patricia Noel's office on Broadway Street, across from a woman who had clearly not slept much either. She set a sealed envelope on the desk between us. My name was written on the front in my sister's handwriting. Underneath it, a single line. Open alone. Not in the house. Your sister came to me last September, Patricia said. She wanted to update her will and establish a separate legal record. She also gave me this letter, with instructions to deliver it to you personally, in private, if anything happened to her. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. She said you would know what to do, Patricia said. She said of everyone she trusted, you were the one who always knew what to do. I didn't feel like someone who knew what to do. I felt like a 62-year-old retired school teacher sitting in a lawyer's office in Orangeville, trying not to fall apart. I opened the envelope. There were 4 pages, handwritten, front and back. I won't repeat all of it here. Some of it is too private, some of it. The parts about her childhood, about the summer our parents took us to Cape Breton, about the way she felt when she married the wrong person and knew at the moment she said yes, those parts belong only to me. But there was a section near the end that changed everything. That changed what the last 2 months of my life became. Janet wrote that she believed her husband had been poisoning her. She didn't use that word. She said she'd been experiencing symptoms for almost a year that her doctor couldn't explain. Fatigue so severe she sometimes couldn't get out of bed, heart palpitations, a tremor in her left hand that came and went. She'd done her own research. Janet was meticulous, always had been, and she'd found a pattern. The symptoms were worse on weekends when her husband was home. They eased when he traveled for work. She'd started keeping a record in a journal she hid in a box of old photographs in the basement. She listed dates, symptoms, what she'd eaten, where her husband had been. She wrote, "I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But if you're reading this, Harold, then I wasn't." She also wrote that she had transferred, quietly and incrementally, a portion of her personal savings into a separate account that her husband didn't know about. The account was in both her name and Owen's. The details were in a second envelope held by Patricia Noel, to be given to Owen on his next birthday, which was 4 months away. She'd done it that way deliberately, so that her husband couldn't contest it as a deathbed transfer. And then she wrote something that made me set the pages down for a moment and breathe. She wrote that she was worried about Owen, that her husband had been slowly, systematically separating Owen from everyone he cared about. Friends, cousins, his part-time job before the hardware store. She'd watched it happen over 3 years and hadn't known how to name it until she started reading about coercive control. She wrote, "He's not stupid, Owen. He knows something is wrong. But he's been living inside it so long he doesn't know what right looks like anymore. Please don't give up on him, Harold. Please don't let him disappear." I folded the letter and put it in my inside jacket pocket. Patricia Noel was watching me. She had the careful look of a woman who had heard difficult things in this office many times before. "What do I do with this?" I asked. "That depends," she said, "on what you believe." I believed my sister. The next question was what to do about it. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I spent 31 years teaching secondary school history in Guelph. My instinct when something goes wrong is to gather information before I say a word. Janet knew that about me. I think that's why she wrote, "You'll know what to do." I didn't go to the police that day. I know that might frustrate some people, but think about what I had. A letter from a dead woman, written in her own hand, describing a suspicion. No physical evidence. No toxicology. My brother-in-law would have had a lawyer on the phone within the hour, and I would have been painted as a grieving man lashing out. I needed more. I drove back to the house. My brother-in-law was at work. He was in property management, kept an office in Brampton, and Owen was alone in the kitchen, eating cereal and staring at his phone. I sat down across from him. I didn't say anything for a moment. Owen looked up. He had Janet's eyes, that same watchful stillness. "How are you sleeping?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not great." "Owen," I said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Not for me, for your mum." Something shifted in his face. He set the spoon down. "Has anything been happening here? Anything that felt wrong to you, even if you couldn't explain it?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "He goes through my phone sometimes. When I'm asleep. I woke up once and caught him. Has he done anything to your mum before she got sick?" Owen looked at the table. He said, "She used to have her own bank account. Separate one, just hers. About 2 years ago she told me not to mention it to Graham anymore." He paused. That's when things started to feel different. Graham. My brother-in-law's name was Graham. I realized I had been avoiding using it even in my own thoughts. Some part of me had already stopped thinking of him as a person with a name. Owen looked up at me. "Uncle Harold, do you think he did something to her?" I didn't answer that directly. I said, "I think we need to find out the truth, and I think we need to do it carefully. Can you trust me for a little while? Can you follow my lead and not say anything to him about this conversation?" Owen nodded slowly. Then he said something that nearly undid me. He said, "I've been pretending to be fine for so long, I don't know what I actually feel anymore." Mum used to say that about trauma, that you can perform okay for so long you forget there's something underneath. My sister had raised a good kid. She'd done that largely alone. I was beginning to understand. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what Janet would have done. I was methodical. I drove up to Orangeville every few days on the pretext of helping Owen sort through Janet's things. Graham didn't object. He didn't like doing it himself. I brought boxes. I made myself useful. I was pleasant to Graham, in the way you are pleasant to someone when you are watching them very carefully. I found the journal, exactly where Janet had described, in the box of photographs in the basement. 3 months of entries, dating back to the previous autumn. Symptoms recorded with the same precision she'd applied to everything in her life: dates, times, what she'd eaten, how she'd felt, whether Graham had been home. The pattern was unmistakable when you looked at it in sequence. It was also heartbreaking. She'd written small observations alongside the medical notes. Things like lilacs are coming. Maybe this year, and Owen laughed at the radio today. First time in weeks. She was tracking her deterioration while also trying to hold on to the ordinary. I photographed every page of the journal on my phone. I gave the originals to Patricia Noel for safekeeping. I also spoke to Janet's family doctor, a woman who had been her GP in Orangeville for over a decade. She was bound by privacy regulations, even in death, but she listened to what I said carefully and then told me, choosing her words with the kind of precision that told me she'd been thinking about this already, that she had referred Janet's file for a secondary review at the coroner's office 2 weeks after the death, before I'd even contacted her, that the initial cause of death had been recorded as cardiac arrhythmia, that she had not been satisfied. I have never admired a doctor more in my life. In the 3rd week, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Owen called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice low and tight. He said Graham had gone through his room while he was at work. That several things had been moved, including a small box of his mother's keepsakes that Owen had been keeping on his dresser. He said Graham hadn't said anything about it, hadn't explained himself. Owen had come home and found the room subtly rearranged and Graham sitting in the living room watching television as if nothing had happened. "He's looking for something," Owen said. "Uncle Harold, I think he knows something is wrong." I told Owen to stay calm. I told him to act normally. I told him, and this was the hardest thing I've ever told anyone, to be patient for just a little while longer. What I did next? I did because Janet asked me to in that letter. She wrote that she trusted my instincts. So I trusted them. I called the Ontario Provincial Police non-emergency line and asked to speak to someone in their criminal investigation unit. I explained what I had. I was expecting skepticism. What I got instead was a detective constable named Andrea Sinclair, who listened for 20 minutes without interrupting and then asked me to come in with the documentation. She was the right person. She took the journal photographs. She took a copy of Janet's letter. She contacted Patricia Noel independently, and then she told me something I hadn't known, that there were existing provisions under Ontario law for ordering a post-mortem toxicology review when new evidence suggested a death may not have been due to natural causes, even after cremation, because cremated remains, in certain circumstances, can still yield detectable traces of some compounds. I hadn't known that. I'd been dreading the cremation as a dead end. It wasn't. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. I kept driving up to Orangeville. I kept helping Owen. I kept being pleasant to Graham at the kitchen table, accepting the coffee he offered, answering his questions about my drive up from Guelph watching him watch me. He was good at the surface. I'll give him that. He was smooth and composed, and he made excellent coffee, and he seemed, to anyone who didn't know what to look for, like a man in appropriate grief. But I had spent 31 years watching teenagers try to hide things. I knew what people look like when they were performing. He started asking questions about Janet's finances in the 5th week. Subtle ones, slipped into casual conversation. Whether I knew if she'd had any accounts he might not be aware of, whether she'd mentioned any property she'd inherited from our parents. She hadn't. There was nothing to inherit. Our parents had died with nothing but a mortgaged house in Hamilton. I answered everything calmly, said I didn't know much about her financial arrangements, that she'd always been private about that. He nodded. He sipped his coffee. He looked out the window at the backyard where the lilac bush was getting its first leaves of spring. Owen called me that night. He'd been careful as I'd asked. But he told me he'd noticed something I hadn't. He said Graham had been making calls from the landline in the evenings. They still had a landline. Janet had insisted on it, and that he'd started doing it after Owen had already gone upstairs. Owen had been listening from the hallway. He'd heard Graham say the name of a financial institution and the words account transfer and a number Owen didn't recognize. I called Detective Constable Sinclair the next morning. The results of the toxicology review came back on a Thursday. I was at home in Guelph when she called. She didn't give me details over the phone, but she asked if I could come to the detachment in Orangeville the following day. I drove up in the rain. She was waiting for me with a colleague, a senior investigator from the Toronto-based unit. They confirmed that the toxicology review had identified elevated concentrations of a cardiac glycoside compound in the cremated remains, consistent, the pathologist had determined, with a toxic dose that could cause fatal arrhythmia and inconsistent with any medication Janet had been prescribed. They had cross-referenced her medical file and her prescription history. She had not been prescribed anything in that category. She had been poisoned. My sister had been right. And she had been right in the worst possible way. I don't know how I drove home that evening. I remember the rain. I remember the tent line looking very dark and very long. I remember pulling into my driveway and sitting in the truck for a long time before I went inside. What happened after that moved faster than I expected. The OPP executed a search warrant on the Orangeville house on a Saturday morning. Graham was home. Owen had been given a reason to be elsewhere. I'd asked him to come to Guelph for the weekend under the pretext of helping me with some work in the garage, and he'd agreed without asking too many questions. By the time I told him what was happening, the search was already underway. We were sitting at my kitchen table when I explained it. I told him everything, the letter, the journal, Patricia Noel, the toxicology results, the months of being careful. I told him his mother had planned all of it, that she had protected him from across the distance of her own dying, had thought of the account and the solicitor and the letter and the box of photographs, and had arranged all of it so that he would not be left alone in a house with a dangerous man and no way out. Owen didn't say anything for a long time. Then he put his face in his hands. He didn't sob loudly. He just shook, quietly, for a while. And when he looked up, his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months. Like something had lifted that he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped feeling its weight. She knew, he said. She knew, I said. Graham was arrested that afternoon. He was charged with first-degree murder and 2 additional counts relating to the financial fraud Patricia Noel had flagged. He had, it turned out, been attempting to transfer a joint investment account that had been in Janet's name into a sole holder account in his own name, which triggered a review by the financial institution that had been ongoing without his knowledge. Owen's observations from the hallway, passed along to Sinclair, had been enough to accelerate that part of the investigation. He is awaiting trial. I won't say more than that, because I don't want to say anything that might complicate the proceedings. Owen moved into my spare bedroom in Guelph 6 weeks after the arrest. He's been here since. He's enrolled in a welding certification program at the college in town, something he'd wanted to do for 2 years and had been quietly talked out of. He still has the box of his mother's keepsakes on his dresser. The lilac bush in Orangeville bloomed in May, and we drove up together to see it. We stood in the backyard and neither of us said very much. We didn't have to. Patricia Noel transferred the account details to Owen on his birthday, as Janet had arranged. He called me afterward. from the parking lot of the credit union on the main street in Orangeville, and he said, "She was really something, wasn't she?" And I said yes. Yes, she really was. I think about something Janet wrote in that letter nearly every day, near the very end, after everything practical had been laid out. The journal, the solicitor, the account, the instructions for me. She wrote something personal. She wrote, "I used to think the bravest thing I ever did was love people who didn't deserve it. Now I think the bravest thing was finally deciding to stop and make sure the people who did deserve it were protected before I ran out of time." I don't know how she did it. I don't know how a person plans for their own death that carefully, while still cutting lilacs and calling her brother about the backyard and walking 3 kilometers every morning, as if the world were ordinary. I think she was braver than anyone will ever know, because most of the courage she had, she spent quietly, in private, on other people. I will not stop paying attention to the people I love. I will not ignore the feeling in my chest that says something is wrong. I will not let anyone make me feel foolish for trusting my sister's word over anyone else's performance of innocence, whatever time I have left. And at 62 in this country, I'm told there's likely a good amount of it. I intend to use it the way Janet would have wanted, showing up, paying attention, and making sure that the people who matter to me know it before I run out of chances to tell them. She gave me that, even at the end, especially at the end. I keep thinking about the lilac bush. Janet called me about it 3 weeks before she died, told me it had finally bloomed after 2 years of nothing, that she was going to cut some and put them in the kitchen. That was the last real conversation we had, not about danger or poison or lawyers or accounts hidden from a man who couldn't be trusted. Just lilacs. Just my sister, happy about something small and ordinary on a Tuesday morning. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what it actually takes to do what she did, to be that frightened, that alone, that sick, and still think clearly enough to find a solicitor, write 4 pages by hand, hide a journal in a box of photographs, and arrange for her son's future without letting anyone see what she was doing. Most people, when they're that afraid, go quiet. They hope it will pass. They tell themselves they're imagining things. Janet didn't do that. She paid attention to what her own body was telling her, she trusted what she saw, and then she acted on it, carefully, over months, without a single person to help her. That's not something you're born with. That's something you build, slowly, through every small choice you make to be honest with yourself, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Owen is the same way, I'm starting to see. He'd been living inside something wrong for so long he couldn't name it anymore. But the moment I sat down at that kitchen table and asked him a direct question, something in him recognized the truth and moved toward it. He could have deflected. He could have protected Graham the way people protect the familiar, even when the familiar is hurting them. He didn't. He told me about the phone calls from the hallway. He trusted me. That took more courage than most people will ever know, because he was doing it from inside a situation that had been specifically designed to make him feel like he had no one. I think about cause and effect a lot these days, not in any cosmic or religious sense. I'm not built that way, but in the plain, observable sense, the choices Graham made, over years, produced a consequence. Every small cruelty, every controlled silence, every time he moved something in Owen's room or asked a question he already knew the answer to, all of it accumulated. And Janet's choices accumulated too. Every journal entry, every quiet transfer, every word she chose for that letter. Both of them were building something in opposite directions. One was building harm. The other was building a way out of it, for the people she loved, in the only time she had left. What I want to carry forward from all of this, and I mean actually carry, not just think about once and set down, is that decency is not passive. It's not enough to mean well or to love people in a general, comfortable way. Janet's decency was active. It had plans. It stayed up late and made careful decisions and wrote things down in case she ran out of time to say them. That kind of character, the kind that holds when everything around it is trying to erode it, doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of a person who kept choosing over and over to be honest rather than convenient, to think clearly rather than react, and to keep going even when keeping going was the hardest possible thing. Owen is in Guelph now. He's enrolled in his welding program. Some mornings I hear him in the kitchen before I'm up, and I think about my sister arranging all of this from a distance, in the dark, with no guarantee any of it would work. She gave him a future she wasn't going to see. That's the truest thing I know about her. I don't want to waste it.